Welcome to this virtual event about the fight for a fair count and the goal of keeping the 2020 census on track. I'm Osito Anevu, a staff writer at the New Republic and your moderator. Before we get started, I should say a few words about our sponsors. This program is being produced in partnership with the Brennan Center for Justice, a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with the NYU School of Law, the Brooklyn Historical Society, which has been a cultural hub for civic dialogue and community outreach for over 150 years, and New York University's Brademas Center, dedicated to civil debate on politics, public policy, and other major issues facing our world. Our topic, again, is the census, and getting an accurate count every 10 years is absolutely critical to our democracy, as that data helps determine the distribution of government resources and representation in the decade ahead. Our panelists are going to speak to some of the challenges that the census faces, including coronavirus pandemic, which fortunately has arrived in the year of the first digital census, which means that you can actually fill out the form online. Get out the word about that if you can. Joining us today to discuss the 2020 census, we're thrilled to be joined by a wonderful panel of experts. Janae Nelson is Associate Director Counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and a professor at law at St. John's University School of Law. Janae, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Osita. Thank you so much for having me.
Adriel Cepeda Derriex is a staff attorney in the ACLU Voting Rights Project. Adriel, thanks for being here.
Hi, Osita. Nice to be here.
And Thomas Wolf is a counsel in the Brennan Center for Justice Democracy Program. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, the panelists and I are going to talk for about 45 minutes before we start fielding questions from the audience. And you can write those questions into the Q&A field at the bottom of your screen before the Q&A begins. The word of guidance I'd offer you in writing your questions is to avoid technical questions. You can't really offer much help as far as filling out your form goes, but the people here can speak to this, why the census is so important and the challenges we're going to face in getting an accurate count this year. And that's where we're going to start our discussion. Now, the Census Bureau has made operational adjustments in the wake of the coronavirus crisis, including the temporary suspension of in-person field activities last month. In doing so, it initially maintained that it would be able to submit a count to the President and Congress by the end of the year. But Commerce Secretary Ross has asked Congress to draft legislation, giving the Bureau a 120-day extension to complete and submit the count. And as far as we know, and this is for all of you, how well has the Bureau been able to respond to the crisis, and how might it impact the accuracy of the count? Maybe Tom, that's a good place for you to start.
So right now it looks like the Bureau is making a pragmatic concession to reality. It's asked to extend its deadlines for collecting data from everyone in the country to Halloween, whereas previously they planned to stop by the end of July. And then it's asked Congress to let it turn over the numbers for apportionment on April 30th and the numbers for redistricting in July, at the end of July the 31st. By all reliable news and intel, this new plan was developed by Census Bureau career folks, and it's based on the Bureau's concerns that the quality of the data and the possibility of counting everyone was severely in question if they tried to move forward with the current plan. This intel jives with my read of the current state of affairs, and I think this really helps draw clarity around what we're dealing with here. The Bureau had to shut down all the work it was planning to do to count rural parts of the country and disaster-hit areas like Puerto Rico because of COVID. This is resulting in large parts of the country basically getting shut out of the census. The national response rate as of this afternoon is 50.7%. That represents about 75 million households. Puerto Rico's response rate is 6%. New Mexico is 39.9%, West Virginia is 39.3%, and Alaska is 33.6%. These are states that rely particularly heavy on the early field work where the Bureau sends people out to doors to drop paper forms for people to respond. But they also give us a preview of what would be coming down the pike for all the other states in the country if the Bureau had to send enumerators out into the field. So, I think it's pretty clear you can't have a census if you can't count Puerto Rico and large parts of the American West. But if the delay had to happen, the Bureau needs to do a better job going forward. The Bureau has presented a timeline, but we need more than a timeline. We need a plan. We want to know in particular how the Bureau is going to decide when it's safe to send door knockers out into the field this summer. We're currently starting to start the early field work in early June and then do the nationwide door knocking in mid-August. How will they know it's safe? It has to start this contingency planning like it's the start of the planning rather than the end. It needs to be more transparent. And it also needs to be more collaborative, giving an opportunity not only for Congress to weigh in, but also the community of stakeholders nationwide who have been helping it for years set up the plan to get everyone counted.
One of the big impacts of a delay, of course, in collecting and reporting a count is that it compresses the amount of time available to do the apportionment redistricting that is based on census data. And that's not just for congressional seats, but all kinds of seats in position at the state and local level. And of course, there are the legal challenges that inevitably follow every count. If we don't get redistricting data until next summer, as the Bureau is now proposing, how much of a problem is that for all of the things that rely upon census data? Maybe that's a question for Tom again.
Happy to help. Just about every state will need to make adjustments. So under the Bureau's initial plan and the way it's worked in the last couple decades, the Census Bureau's first created the numbers for apportionment. It turns them over to the president at the end of December. Then it moves on to create the files that each state will use to redraw their maps. Those are normally due at the end of March in 2021. The Bureau has changed that plan now, and now they think that they can't get the numbers for states totally done by July 31st. This creates a problem. Just about every state in the country is going to have to make adjustments. Certain states will have a harder time of it because they have laws on the books that set up very specific timelines and deadlines for redistricting. And some states have elections coming up sooner rather than others. So Virginia and New Jersey have statewide elections starting in 2021. There may be things that we can do to manage this process, but overwhelmingly the work will have to be to hold the line and to maintain as much public input, oversight, and accountability as possible. Folks who have been following the debates over partisan gerrymandering in the Supreme Court over the past few years will know that one of the big problems we had this past decade was processes where map drawers were allowed to kind of take over the process for themselves and draw districts to benefit the politicians that were in their party. The Supreme Court ducked this issue, but redistricting commissions are getting set up all around the country, and the push, and I think where the public really is on this now, is for things to become more transparent rather than less. What we don't want to see happen is this shuffling around of timelines or map drawers sort of struggling to get the maps done quickly, using that as an excuse to cut voters out of the project. So we need to make sure that we maintain transparency, public input, and unity mapping processes. The Census Bureau can help this. The Bureau generally has been releasing its redistricting files on a rolling basis. So one of the things it could do to ease this problem is, after it's done with the apportionment count, start putting out the files for the states that need them soonest. Put Virginia and New Jersey at the front of the process and don't wait until the end of July. I think the other thing I would throw out there, obviously this is going to create disruption, but the ultimate purpose for extending the timelines is to get better data. And it's hard to run a good redistricting process with bad data. Extensions are going to complicate the process, but the idea is to make the substance a little firmer and sounder by making sure that we can create numbers for 2020 that actually represent the full diversity of the population and its growth since the last decade.
That goes nicely into my next question. Obviously, before the coronavirus crisis even hit, this year's census was the subject of a lot of controversy. Last year, the Supreme Court struck down the Trump administration's effort to include a citizenship question on the census. It was a victory for advocates who insisted that kind of a question could suppress responses from the Latinx community and weaken representation and facilitate deportations in immigrant-heavy locales. But even without a citizenship question, the census has had to pour a lot of resources and millions of dollars in efforts to fight misinformation and reassure people about responding to the census. But first, for those who might not have followed this closely, we should probably reframe the debate over this citizenship question briefly. Why was it important that there not be a citizenship question on this year's census? And what impact do we think that controversy has had on this year's count? And this, I just could ask the whole group this one, I guess.
I'll jump in. This is Janae. The possible inclusion of a citizenship question was an enormously frightening prospect for so many of us who are civil rights advocates and who want to ensure that communities of color are not undercounted. The threat of the citizenship question would have likely led to an undercount of up to 6.5 million people. And we know with the changing demographics of this country, we are on pace to become a majority minority country by 2045. It is critically important that we count all of the residents of this country and account for the growth of communities that are often underserved and undercounted in the census. And the threat of a citizenship question would have deterred many who are either immigrants themselves or live in immigrant adjacent communities from participating in the census. Even though census data is held confidential and it's not disclosable to the federal government and other agencies other than the Census Bureau, it's protected under Title 13, many people don't understand that. And the idea that there would be a question about your citizenship status suggests that there is an interrogation about where you fit in this country and who you are and what your status is, and a way in which that information may be weaponized against you. We are still very concerned that there's a residual effect of the threat of that question being included on the census. And of course, we can't ignore that it isn't just the possible inclusion of the question that was so concerning to many, but it's also couched in xenophobic rhetoric from this administration and anti-immigrant sentiments that suggest that so many people of color are not welcome in this democracy. What we can say now, for sure and for certain, is that we prevailed. Many of the groups that sought to challenge that question ultimately put enough pressure on the government so that it backed off of it. And communities of color should feel welcome in the census process, should feel encouraged, and should certainly be counted because of the many resources that depend on an accurate count of our population.
Yeah, I would agree with all of what Janae said. Whenever I get this question, I'd like to start by saying that the short answer is that there shouldn't be a citizenship question because it arguably doesn't matter. The Constitution tells the federal government to do an actual enumeration, and it says that states need to draw their districts based on the whole number of persons. So that just means everyone, full stop. So the short answer is you were adding a question that you knew would stop millions from answering the census and hurting the goal of doing what the Constitution is actually telling you to do and count everyone. The second point I'd like to make is that the citizenship question is has been known for decades to be particularly damaging to the census count. There's this general understanding that any question you add to the census marginally in some way would reduce the number of people that would answer it. But for decades, the citizenship question has been understood to be this very, very loaded one that going into the Supreme Court, at least with the numbers that were on our briefs, it was understood that it would drop responses by about 6.5 million. And I believe that was the Census Bureau's conservative estimate. That number was then revised upwards after the Supreme Court decision came down to about 9 million. And that's the population of New Jersey, which has 12 representatives in the House and 14 votes in the Electoral College. So the threat was really, really difficult to overstate.
I think a few more notes that I would throw in, just kind of amplifying everything that we've heard thus far, is that the stakes in the citizenship question legal fight were kind of weirdly asymmetrical in the sense that there was a way where Trump could win even if he lost in front of the court, which he ended up losing in front of the court thanks to the work of the ACLU and other folks. What the administration wanted to do was undercut the political power of immigrant communities and communities of color. And the big idea here was you put the question on the census, you win in front of the Supreme Court, you collect all that citizenship data from people around the country, then you fork it over to partisan map drawers who then draw the non-citizen population out of the maps. But the administration could also win even if they lost in front of the court if they succeeded in creating enough confusion and fear around the census that people became scared to self-respond. And then they're not reflected in the data that goes to the map drawers. And so it's kind of a different mechanism to the same end. Trump clearly lost in court. There is no citizenship question on the 2020 census. There's no hope in it coming back this year. It's dead. But the situation on the ground looks maybe more like the way Trump would want it than we would want it. About 70% of adults think that there's a citizenship question on the census. 60.6% of adults in families with non-citizens And 62.8% of adults in families with only naturalized citizens thought that the census would have the question this year. And concerns about confidentiality and repercussions are very high. Nearly 1/3 of adults are extremely or very concerned about how their answers to the census are going to be used. It's illegal to use it against them, but that fear still exists. I think there are a lot of open questions about the direct link between the citizenship question and the precise response rates we're seeing. But I have a strong sense that even given all these problems like the pandemic, it's had a major depressive effect. And I think that in a certain level, the question of causation is kind of beside the point, because the ultimate fight about the citizenship question was about ensuring that everyone in the country gets counted. And ultimately, it doesn't matter if everyone in the country isn't getting counted because of the coronavirus or the digital divide or the citizenship question. If you cared about defeating the citizenship question, what you ultimately care about is making sure that everyone in the country gets counted. If there's an undercount anywhere in the country, it's now our responsibility to eliminate it.
This citizenship question is that there are a couple of new court cases that have some bearing, could come to bear on the way that this census count is used for apportionment. One is the suit filed by the state of Alabama against the Department of Commerce that wants to exclude the undocumented from population counts. The other is a suit from an organization called La Unión del Pueblo Entero that wants to block Trump, his executive order last year, directing the Census Bureau to obtain citizenship information from state governments and other federal agencies. And earlier this year, in keeping with that executive order, the Department of Homeland Security announced that they were going to provide that citizenship information to the Bureau. Could any of you talk about each of these cases and their potential implications?
I'm happy to take a shot. I guess, just to take a step back, I just wanted to point out that the question of who counts in the census has always been contentious. As Janae has written, like the original sin, of course, is the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. The framers make a compromise that say slaves count as 3/5 of people, and that's terrible for many obvious dehumanizing reasons. But maybe one of the worst reasons ends up being that it just artificially inflates the power of the slave states and sets up a tension that the country can't get out from under, and you're at war 100 years later. But it's always been people, not voters, that have counted, always. Women didn't vote until 100 years ago, or didn't have a right to vote anyway, but they counted from the beginning. Children have never voted, but they've counted. And again, enslaved persons, slaves at least partially counted under this, under the 3/5 framework. In the recent era, the big issue has been arguments over people who should either not be counted or not be included for apportionment purposes. And what you've had are groups from the right of the American political spectrum trying to change the rules on who gets to count, particularly by arguing that non-citizens and immigrants should not be included, that it should just be voters. And to cut to the quick of it, it's a political calculus. If non-citizens don't count, then cities count less, and wider rural states and areas count more. They get more representation, more federal money, etc. And that was largely the point of litigation over adding a citizenship question, the underlying point, and it's the point at the heart of the cases you mentioned. And I can briefly speak about the Alabama case. That's a lawsuit filed by the state of Alabama in which the state is trying to say that counting non-citizens in the census itself is unlawful. The case itself challenges the so-called residence rule, which just says that citizens of foreign countries are counted where they live in the US without regard for immigration status. So Alabama says essentially that this rule benefits other states at its expense. That New York, for example, shouldn't get a benefit from having more non-citizens or more immigrants. And the implications of that ruling would frankly be pretty earth-shattering and dire. You'd have a wholesale shift in the way we view American democracy. Overnight, you'd have, like I said, more rural, less diverse states gain more representation than they've had in decades. Just two things to say on that case. On paper, the case should be an easy one. Alabama should lose. In 2016, the Supreme Court in a case named Evanwell versus Abbott coming out of Texas, rejected the view that states must redistrict based only on the number of voter eligible populations that they have. Essentially, that it said that they can include non-citizens, that they can use total population. If that's so, then it seems pretty painfully obvious that the census should also include those people as part of the count. The problem, of course, is that a lot has changed since 2016. A lot has changed since February. But for sure, the Supreme Court looks very different than it did when Evanwell was decided. So, that's a concern. And the other point that's interesting about the Alabama case is that the Department of Commerce is the defendant. So normally when someone sues the federal government, the Justice Department defends the policy that's being challenged. But here you have Alabama suing the federal government to force it to do something that the present administration very likely wants to do anyway. It wants to let, it would be likely fine keeping non-citizens off the census count. So it's just been great to see civil rights groups like the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund and various states with views opposing Alabama's and the Fed government to intervene. They've essentially asked the court to come in as if they were the ones being sued to begin with. And they're in there defending against what Alabama is trying to do.
Yeah, these cases are so important if we want to look at this historically and how there's always been an effort to undercount communities of color in order to secure political power. And as Adriel said, this is already written and baked into Article 1 of the Constitution, which is the enumeration clause that not only counted African Americans as 3/5 of a person, but also discounted indigenous persons and continue to do so even after the 14th Amendment was ratified and wiped out the 3/5 clause. So this has been a struggle in the same way that the right to vote has been a struggle since the inception of this country. The right to be counted has also been a struggle from the very beginning, because it's about the allocation of political power. So in the same way that slave states benefit from the way we allocate votes to the Electoral College, you see states now trying to discount their populations of people who aren't citizens of the United States in order to have that same imbalance of power to concentrate power among a smaller class of people that really does not reflect the changing demographics of this country. It will further skew what we already see being a very counter-majoritarian trend in this country, where the popular vote, the will of the lion's share of the population is not reflected in our politics, is not reflected in our representation. And all of that flows from who gets counted in the census. So you asked earlier about what the consequence would be for a delay of 4 months in getting the data for redistricting. At the Legal Defense Fund, we are litigating redistricting cases every redistricting cycle and often mid-cycle. And a delay in getting that data could be critical to the type of community input that we like to see to ensure that Black and Brown communities and Asian communities and language minorities have a say in how the lines are drawn to elect their representatives. And if the data comes late, that's a shorter window for those communities to weigh in. And of course, we want everyone to be safe. We don't want to compromise enumerators, census takers, or the people who they count, but we need to make sure that people are counted. So to Tom's point, it's not just about having a timeline. We also need a plan to get people counted. We need people to get online. We need follow-up to happen. Census takers usually knock on about 5 million doors when they are doing their enumeration, when they follow up from the initial invitation to fill out the census. And if we don't get that process going, and if we don't double up and try to concentrate our efforts to make up for this lost time, we will all suffer as a democracy.
One other thing that I would throw in just to keep heightening the urgency here, and it goes back to these two cases. We didn't go in depth on the other case, the Lupe case in Maryland, but the way I think about the Lupe case and I think about the Alabama case is that they're basically just continuations of the citizenship question fight. They're all about different ways of manipulating the system to erase the political power of communities of color and immigrant communities in the country. Folks may remember back this past summer, the Supreme Court said citizenship question can't move forward. And President Trump spent about 2 weeks kind of hemming and hawing and pontificating about how he was going to go back and find another way to put the question on the form. Then on July 11th, in a very simultaneously depressing and frightening press conference, President Trump gave up. But as a way of sort of saving face and keeping this scheme going, he announced that he was ordering the Census Bureau to create a file, which now is likely to be a file of the citizen voting age population in the country. Not their names, but the numbers of people. So that could be given out as a supplement to the redistricting numbers, so that when maps get redrawn in 2021 or 2022 at this point, depending on the delays, the map drawers will be able, if they want, to cut non-citizens out of the count. Now, this is clearly completely unconstitutional, as Adriel related, but it hasn't stopped people from trying to move forward. So there's a lawsuit now to block the Census Bureau from producing that file. The idea being that it's sort of the next front. Like I said earlier, you could erase people's political power in any number of different ways. If you can't get it by method 1, you can get it by method 2. So this case is sort of flown under the radar, but I think the same kind of well-founded and completely reasonable indignation that we all had about the citizenship question should also be focused on questions that are these more kind of bureaucratic, maybe a little less easier to understand, but nonetheless still consequential questions.
Yes, I think each of you has alluded to. It doesn't seem like an accident that all of this stuff is surrounding a census this year that could provide the clearest look yet at where we're going as a country as we transition towards a majority-minority population. As Janae mentioned, undermining an accurate count out of demographic anxieties or political reasons isn't by any means a new phenomenon. In fact, Janae, I believe you wrote an article for Columbia Law Review last year about some of this history. One of the lines in it was, history confirms, he wrote, that people of color are disappeared from population count unless it's politically or financially expedient to count them, and when doing so does not invite political or economic accountability to or for them. So what are some of the ways, Janae, the other major ways that those populations have been disappeared from the count historically, and how many of them persist today? You mentioned the 3/5 compromise, you mentioned not counting the indigenous, but what are some of the other major ways in which we've failed to accurately keep count of some of the most vulnerable populations in this country?
Well, one of the most obvious ways that is such a tragic consequence of the prison industrial complex is the counting of incarcerated persons, not in the communities from which they come, but in the communities that they are transported to, which in many cases are very different demographically than the communities that they and their families live in. And that's called prison gerrymandering. That's a way in which different communities bolster the number of inhabitants that are counted for purposes of allocating political power by counting people who are incarcerated. The people who are incarcerated are not represented. Their interests are typically not represented by the elected officials who use their bodies for their power, but don't give anything to them in terms of representation in whatever body it may be. We've seen a wonderful trend in the opposite direction over the past 10 years or so, with states like New York and Maryland and others deciding to count incarcerated persons in the communities that they come from and where their loved ones still are, and where they will return to when they're released. And that is the right way to count individuals and to allocate power back to the communities that have so much power being siphoned off through the incarceration, the disproportionate incarceration of Black and brown bodies. So that is, I think, the most salient example of ways in which Black and brown communities remain undercounted. But there are many other ways. There's the digital divide, where so many of us take it for granted that we could be on this Zoom call, that we can use technology to connect with one another. But there's still a significant number of households that don't have digital access, that don't have, there's about 30% of low-income households that don't have a smartphone and don't have the access to technology that we all think is at everyone's fingertips. It's actually not true across the board, and that creates a disproportionate challenge for individuals who are now filling out the census more online now than ever before. There are fewer resources, as we just talked about, to knock on a door and get someone to fill out a census form by hand, or to pick up the phone and call the Census Bureau and be counted. So that's another way in which we wind up with an undercount of communities of color. And then when you think about the fact that white communities are often overcounted, that results in what we call a differential undercount, meaning that there's a big gap between the overcounting of white communities, the undercounting of communities of color. And when you think about the allocation of political power, when you think about the allocation of federal resources, we're talking about more than $675 billion federal dollars that rely on census data to determine how those funds are allocated. You can see all of the injustice and inequality that results from an undercount, that it's not just a mere inaccuracy, it's actually an inequity that results from not counting people accurately.
So when it comes to the target of the citizenship question, specifically the Latinx population, it seems to me, somebody who observes politics, given the population growth we've already seen over the past 20 years, it doesn't seem like the Latinx community has a amount of political representation and power commensurate with their share of the population. When people talk about this, they often talk about voting rates and registration, and all of that's really important, obviously. But everything that's happened with this census, and the long confusion, and the long history of confusions and shenanigans on the part of people responsible for apportionment and people running the census, Janae's just talked about, all that suggests to me that it's more than just about voting and registration. There's more to the question of why Latinos are underrepresented than the voter side of things. Adriel, you do a lot of work on cases involving dilution of minority votes and disenfranchisement, broadly speaking. And I was wondering if you could talk about, beyond the controversy surrounding this particular census, what are the other extant barriers to achieving a full count representation in those communities?
Sure, Rosita. Unfortunately, any voting rights issue that is usually in the news or you can think of will disproportionately affect Latinx voters and people of color. Top of mind these days, just because of how topical and everywhere it is, just voting in the middle of a pandemic. We didn't know what that really looked like until very recently. Over a dozen states still require voters to have an excuse to vote absentee or by mail. And we saw in Wisconsin 2 weeks ago these pictures of long lines of voters, which Wisconsin health officials now are certain will drive up case numbers and will likely result in more cases and sadly more deaths. We also now know that COVID-19 disproportionately harms Black people and Latinx people. So, when you have, for example, the Surgeon General of the United States telling communities of color to think of Big Mama and think of Abuela, there's many reasons that's an awful comment for an offensive comment for condescending reasons. But if you set that aside for a second, he's telling communities of color, you need to take care of yourself. You need to stay indoors. And this will hurt you if you step outside. It will hurt your community. So as with so many aspects of life in America, it's turning out that being a person of color is a pre-existing condition for COVID-19 also that puts these communities at greater risk. You're essentially telling these states that don't allow mail-in votes are telling people or communities of color, you are at greater risk, but also we're not going to give you the tools to vote from home. So you're either going to have to step outside to cast your vote and expose yourself and your communities to greater risk, or you don't vote. So that's, the most topical example I can think of. But again, it just unfortunately just cascades down to hurt Latinx communities and communities of color. Prison-based gerrymandering, as Janae mentioned, is huge. Discrimination in the redistricting process, so so-called racial gerrymanders are going and still going strong. But voter ID, which has been very much in the news for a decade now, disproportionately affect Latinx voters and Black voters who may lack ID at higher rates or have less access to the documents needed to get an ID. For example, in the case of an elderly naturalized person who just doesn't have the means or the way to find their naturalization papers from decades prior. And then the last one I'll mention, because it's so insidious and so prevalent, is just voter purges. States have ramped up list maintenance efforts, and what that means is they'll increasingly look for ways to systematically purge people they suspect or say or claim are ineligible voters from their voter rolls. And there's several problems with this. The false positives are just very high, and they all, again, disproportionately hurt Latinx voters and voters of color. States like Texas did last year, for example, would use DMV information where someone has at some point in their life set their non-citizen to a state agency to purge people from their lists. The problem with that is that thousands of people naturalize every year and become eligible voters. So when Texas said last year there were 100,000 voters that were illegally registered, and the governor went out and said that these people were actually voting, the slightest bit of due diligence showed that it was really a fraction of the 100,000 that were identified that were really non-citizens, and even those were not there for for nefarious reasons. It was usually that they slipped through some kind of crack in the process.
Can I jump in and say a little bit also about the idea that there's such disproportionate power compared to population? It is, if you think about the past two decennial censuses and apportionment, they resulted in a shift of 12 seats in each census. There were 12 congressional seats that moved based on the population count. And if you look at where the growth is in this country, 56% of the growth of our population over the past decade is a result of a burgeoning Latinx population. When you look at places like Texas, where 89% of that state's growth is based on the growth of people of color in that state. And then you look at the representation coming out of Texas and tell me whether those complexions match. They don't. The power of the number of people in our country who are people of color and the power that they represent in the halls of our government is wildly disproportionate. And that's why this count is so very critical. That's why when we think about apportionment and the shifting of congressional seats and what states are growing and will get more political power, and when they do, will it inure to the benefit of the populations within that state that are the cause of that growth, it usually doesn't measure up in that way. And so it's important that we not only talk about the census, but that we also talk about, once we even amass those numbers, how do we ensure that those numbers translate into power? How do they translate into the appropriate apportionment? How do they translate into fair redistricting?
All right, well, I think it is just about time for questions, and we have a lot from our audience tuning in. I think you can continue to send in questions as I go through them, same way you have been through the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. But I'm just going to go ahead and start reading some of the ones that we've gotten already. This person says, I have a fairly good understanding of the procedures for delaying the census and what that could mean, but I'm lacking clarity around what, if any, budget impact this could have, and what would be needed by the Census Bureau to complete operations in 2020 and to finish the work they have to do to deliver the data in 2021. So I guess the question is just, what kind of resources are now going to have to go to delaying the census? How much is that going to cost the Bureau and the government more broadly? And will the Bureau be able to manage that?
The Bureau has a contingency fund that by some reports is about $1.4 billion. By other reports, it's about $2 billion, with the idea being that they can use that money to offset any kind of disasters they might have. I mean, as it turns out, the Bureau, based on some court documents it's filed recently, looks like it's been planning for about 55% response rate as being kind of its worst case scenario. The way response rates are shaping up right now, we're likely to get kind of in that neighborhood. And so the Bureau is at least kind of within the boundaries of what it's planned for. Whether as a practical matter, it's going to be able to offset all these problems, that's an open question. I mean, so a concrete example, before the new plan was put into place, the Bureau was aiming to get 60.5% of the households in the country to respond to the census by the end of April or the beginning of May. If we hit that number, the Bureau thought it would need about 320,000 door knockers to cover all of the remaining households in the country that hadn't responded. If the number drops down to 55%, then the Bureau thought it would need to hire 500,000 people. So if we're even below that, we're talking about even more people. That's a huge number of people, even in an economy where the unemployment rate has spiked. It's just a lot of people to train and manage. There are also then questions about, is the body of people they would hire to do door knocking over the summer, the end of the summer, different in meaningful ways from the folks that they could have gotten earlier in the year? Some of the big concerns there are whether the door knockers will have the necessary language competency to make sure that all of the communities they're reaching out to they can actually communicate with, and whether they have the other cultural competencies to understand how to gain people's trust and how to elicit truthful, full, accurate responses from them. So there's a huge open question, but at least conceivably the Bureau does have a pretty sizable fund in place to take care of these, on the scale of things, probably medium-sized adjustments. If they get bigger than that, more questions.
There's another related question here about whether the White House actually has the authority to change the census timeline. This person worries that they could block an adjusted timeline knowing it could prevent a more accurate count of the historically undercounted. So who has the authority here? Who's making that decision? And could the Trump administration be playing with the timeline to continue their efforts to undercount the historically undercounted? Maybe that's a question for Tom again.
Or Janae.
Or Janae.
Well, the authority to do the census is in the Constitution. There's a mandate that it be delivered by the end of the year, but of course we are in a pandemic. These are unprecedented circumstances, and again, it is critically important that people are safe, and that's something I think we're all committed to. Whether this administration has the authority to move dates, to underfund the census, which has already been happening. It happened even before the citizen question nonsense. That's never been a barrier to this administration trying to manipulate the count and this important foundation for how power is allocated. So I unfortunately don't think that that's the question. I do think that we have to keep our eyes peeled for efforts to undermine the census count on every level. The American Community Survey that comes out to supplement the census, which is where we usually get more accurate data about hard to count communities, is another area where we need to make sure that we protect that effort, and that those data are also used in the right way to ensure a more equitable allocation of political power and federal resources. But again, I just don't think that we can rely on whether the administration technically has the power or not, because as we've seen with the citizenship question, with the Voter Suppression Commission, with so many other efforts, it really doesn't matter whether it's constitutionally grounded for the administration to try to manipulate the circumstances in its favor.
Somebody has a question about what census operations, or the delay of census operations, means for households in some of the states mentioned earlier that are dependent on hand-delivered contacts. So places, localities where they really, really depend on people going out into different neighborhoods, obviously, that's often minority communities. How does the delay impact their ability to get counted and who the census is able to send over?
It has a massive impact, and I think that it's pretty easy to see the impact just looking at the self-response data that the Census Bureau has been reporting. The Bureau actually every day on its website, which you can find if you Google just 2020 census response rates, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, updates with the day's returns, and then it color codes the map so you can see, not just at the state level, but even down to the census tract level, how folks are responding. And one of the things that you'll notice if you look at that map is that the colors for very low response rates are currently on Puerto Rico, New Mexico, and West Virginia. Also, Alaska is still kind of in the danger zone. These are all places where those early census procedures that the questioner mentioned are really key, because what those procedures are doing basically, well, maybe to take a step back, the way the census basically works is it's based off the USPS master address file. There's more added to it, but the basic concept is the census is keyed to postal addresses. If you live in communities, particularly rural communities, but also disaster hit communities, where the postal address system is not a good way of finding where people are spending the bulk of their time, you need to choose other methods. And one of the ways the Bureau does that is by sending people out into the field early with the paper form in hand to drop them off with people so they can send them back. They weren't able to do that for the most part this spring, and so there's a huge correlation that folks at CUNY, Steve Rumaleski, who does a weekly update on this, have done a good job mapping out how a lot of these low response areas map onto the places that didn't get this update leave process. And the reason why I highlighted this at the top of the hour is that in many respects, what we're seeing with those states makes clear what the stakes are for the door knocking phase that's supposed to start on August 11th for the rest of the country. The Bureau is probably only going to be able to get, in its best estimations, about 60% of the country to respond without getting their door knocked. And if you can't knock doors, it's very hard to get people to respond, as these early states are showing us. So unfortunately, I think these states could be a prelude if there aren't firmer plans developed to make sure that everyone is reached either at the door or on the phone, by email, text messages, webinars, Twitter, social media. There needs to be contact throughout the whole country.
We have a question about census confidentiality. The Census Bureau touts personally identifiable information as protected by Title 13, and with the online response option, cybersecurity is meeting the highest standards. However, many have still expressed fundamental concern about their information being protected. Is there any reason to doubt the confidentiality that the census promotes? Can we really be confident that people's personally identifiable information is being protected?
Yeah, that's a prevalent concern, and I think everything we've talked about up until now makes it understandable why people feel that way. But the reality is the law does protect your personally identifiable information. There's a process by which that information is scrambled. It is consolidated so that it is not traceable back to an individual household, and it is protected against being shared with other federal agencies. People often ask about the FBI or ICE agents or other entities that cause anxiety and fear in various communities, and that information is protected from disclosure, and that is something that we need to make sure our friends and family understand, because it's understandable that people will feel less confident in sharing their information if they believe that it can somehow come back to harm them. But that is not the case, and it is worse to count yourself out of this process than to have the fear of a non-existent threat keep you from having you and your community and your family fully counted.
I would also add, I mean, that a lot of people are watching and paying attention to what this administration or anyone that follows does with the data. So advocates and litigators and community groups are very ready to jump into court if there are any shenanigans going on with the privacy of respondents.
All right, this is a question that ties both the citizenship question and the coronavirus together. This person says, I am on a complete count community, and we had census hubs ready to go before COVID. Given the climate of distrust and the threat of the citizenship question, we were relying on community centers to be safe, trusted spaces, which had played an important role in people completing the census. Now that there's no in-person, how do we accomplish that mission? So this person is basically asking, given the threat of the coronavirus, the inability of people to sort of congregate, gather, what are the ways in which, if you're active, involved in the census, you can do outreach to communities that we really need to reach?
Well, I think encouraging, which I've been trying to do a lot, encouraging people to take advantage of the form online is important. One of the things we could all take a moment and do is go into our phones, go into our contact lists, and send a note to everyone by text. Have you filled out your census form? And ask them to do the same. It's the same thing as, you know, getting people out to vote and getting people to register. This should be part of our civic responsibility and part of our civic engagement. In fact, Ari Berman, a reporter who does a lot of work around voting rights issues, says that this is the biggest American civic event in the country. And it really is, because it's not just for eligible voters, it's not just for citizens, it is literally for every resident of this country. So we can do our part by encouraging people to use the online option. We can circulate information about the phone number, because you can also call and fill out the census form by phone. We can do everything we can to encourage participation while being safe. And to the extent that we do interface with others, this is this should be a main topic of conversation.
We have an opportunity that's kind of emerging in the next few weeks. I mean, we've raised already the issue of the digital divide, where not everyone has access to the internet, whether it's through a computer or their phone. But by the end of this month, the Bureau should have delivered a paper form to every mailing address in the country, at least any of the mailing addresses that haven't responded already. So if you think that friends, family members, neighbors may not have responded yet because they don't have the internet, by the end of the month, they will have the means to respond by paper. And so now is a really great time to start getting into people's inboxes, their social media, get people on the phone, to make sure that they know that the kind of last bridge for them to self-respond in the census is coming now.
So we have two questions related to this idea of over or undercounting. One person asks, what exactly is meant by overcount when we say that white communities are overcounted relative to other segments of the population? Is it a matter of those other populations are counted poorly, and so that makes representation go up in white communities by comparison? Or are there ways in which literally we're overcounting the actual number of white people in this country? And then the other question is how the census accurately counts the homeless.
On the question of overcounts and undercounts, this is actually another thing, and I apologize to everyone at home who's probably now blinded by the setting sun that's lighting up the side of my face. I'll try to get closer to the camera so it's not as glaring. one key thing that the Bureau does with every census is it runs basically a second mini census, in a manner of speaking, to try to see how accurate it's been in not only counting people, but also counting their characteristics. It's called the post-enumeration survey. There are open questions about what the plan is for that now that the timelines have been moved and whether it will also be timely, but that's sort of the main source of information we get from this. When we talk about overcounting and overcounting the white population, one theme that you may have noticed over the course of the evening is that the census is not sort of protected from all of the other structural inequalities that run through all aspects of American life. In fact, it not only reflects those inequalities, but because of its role in things like funding and political power, it can amplify those inequalities. So the same way, we see a dynamic, for instance, where homeownership, second homes are overwhelmingly owned by white people. And like I mentioned, the census goes to mailing addresses. It doesn't go to people. And so you can run into a dynamic where people who own multiple homes respond to the census more than once, not necessarily on purpose, but not knowing that they're only supposed to respond once. And so you get a situation where you can end up counting not just one person, but whole families of people more than once. Inequalities in terms of who goes away to school can also reflect itself in the census, where you might have families that are counting their kids both at home and at school, at least in a normal year. Things have gotten a little weird this year. But what the Bureau can do is basically it gets its census numbers, it knows the characteristics that people have reported, then it will go around to a small sample of houses and do a face-to-face interview and basically re-canvass them, then compare the results. And when they do this, they can see, oh, the census numbers, for instance, in 2010, overcounted non-Hispanic white people by about 0.84%, and it undercounted, say, with their categories non-Hispanic Black by about 2%. And then they can use those numbers to figure out the differential undercounts. So undercounts and overcounts are basically just expressions that the census probably either counted people more than once, failed to count all the people it should have, or it also has statistical methods for filling in houses when people are missing, and it might mean that they basically created a person they shouldn't have created.
And the homeless population is a particular population that, as we can imagine, is difficult to count, but the census devotes particular resources and days to counting individuals at shelters and even in open spaces where they may reside temporarily in order to capture that population. It's obviously not perfect and doesn't capture all individuals who are without shelter, but there is a dedicated effort on the part of the Bureau to count homeless persons where they are temporarily being housed or if they are out of shelter.
Somebody has just asked if it would be possible to do some of the redistricting process in 2021 and then finalize the whole country's redistricting, or finalize the data. I guess finalizing, the question is, I want to know if you can do partial redistricting based on the data you have in before the whole count is complete, and then finalize the rest of the redistricting process once everything has been sent in. If it can be done in parts. I think the answer would probably be no.
I think it depends on what you mean by partial. If a state, I think Tom suggested this earlier, that to the extent that redistricting data is available and it's made available to those states who have statewide elections, for example, like Virginia and New Jersey, then those states can begin their redistricting cycle first. But it's sort of hard to parse the question without knowing exactly what the target of the redistricting would be.
I guess that the one other point that comes to mind is many states also have built in their statutes sort of outline how the process takes shape and outline the dates that that's not to, it's probably not to answer the question directly, but just to say that there's many things at play here that would maybe need to also be altered or modified in this case by the states.
And then there's another related question about whether the Census Bureau could use statistical sampling to fill out some of the data now that the in-person account has been delayed by coronavirus.
That would be, in a normal world, maybe a good answer. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court said a few years ago that, at least as a matter of the Census Act, it would be illegal for the Census Bureau to use statistical sampling to generate the numbers that are used for apportionment. That doesn't mean that those techniques couldn't be used for, say, the numbers for redistricting, but at least when it comes time to create the numbers to divvy up seats in Congress, that won't be a possibility.
There's several questions also about the USPS. There's been talk that the USPS could run out of money. And some question about whether the Trump administration, Republicans, would be willing to step in and adequately fund Postal Service, and what the Census Bureau might do in the case that USPS stops functioning. I think that's a very hard question to answer if anybody wants to take a whack at it. But I guess you could turn it into a broader question about, this is the first truly digital census year. It took us a little while to get here. So maybe somebody could talk about, why this is the first year now that there's a online option available for everybody, and what other changes we might be able to see and ability to respond in the years ahead.
Well, this underscores why it is so important to have a publicly funded postal service. So if you were thinking about another reason to save the USPS, the census count would be one of them. It enables there to be a fairer count, even though it's not a perfect system. It definitely has a lot of reach that is helpful to communities that need that access. I mean, to the broader question of how I guess the connection between the USPS and the census, and then you tried to reframe it. I don't know that I have an answer to that one per se, but there's I think we need to support as many ways as possible to have access, and we mentioned I was looking up the phone numbers, I didn't have it handy, but I can provide the phone number to the Census Bureau to call. You can use the forum, you can go online. There have been concerns about the digital divide, and I mean, I think we still have them, and that has been in part why everyone hasn't embraced a full online census. But I think with the advent of greater technology and greater access, we're seeing more opportunities to engage the government online through many processes, and the census is just one that's catching up. But there's still the regular old phone and the regular old form. For the phone, you can call 1-800-923-8282. That's 1-800-923-8282 to speak to the Census Bureau's customer service and get assistance in filling out a form. They have assistance in a wide variety of languages as well, for those who don't speak English as a first language or need assistance for other reasons. So let's avail ourselves of these opportunities.
All right, well, we've got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the panel one last question. 10 years from now, we're going to be in for the 2030 census. Now, I was wondering if each of you could talk about what your hopes for that census are. What are the biggest changes that you would like to see the next time around? And maybe we could start with Adriel.
Hello?
Hey.
Oh, sorry. I think we've touched on the point broadly in speaking of several issues. I just hope that it's a census that reflects the diversity and the growing and the changing demographics of the nation. That the country is projected to go through some very consequential shifts in demographics in the next 20 years. And that's what these cases and these court battles have all been about. This can all get pretty technical, maybe even boring and procedural at times. But it's also the stuff that democracy in the United States is made of. So, who counts determines what the country looks like, and leaving people out of the count can also determine what the country looks like, as Tom said. So I think that the North Star is pretty easy. Our democracy should look like the country that we are.
Janae, you want to go next?
Sure. By 2030, I'd love to see every person who is incarcerated, and hopefully there'll be far fewer than we have now, counted in the communities that they come from. I'd like to see a fully accurate count of historically undercounted and hard to count communities. And that can be done by making the census even more accessible than it currently is. Hopefully we will not be facing anything close to the health crisis that we're currently in. And we can use every possible measure, including technology, including old-fashioned door knocking if necessary. And what I'd like to see, I think most of all, is an embrace of engaging the census and engaging all forms of civic participation, like voting, like engaging even in redistricting processes, become the norm, that there's a full appreciation of the stakes and there are fewer barriers to participating in the ways that can make our democracy fairer and in service of all.
And lastly, Tom.
There's a lot of things that I'd like to see, but I think one sort of systemic change that would be really beneficial is some restoration of sanity in the constitutional and legal discourse around the census. I mean, we dealt with the citizenship question that sort of came up out of nowhere. People fought that back, and it seemed like the census was upright again. But as we discussed today, there are now all these other attempts to figure out some way to kind of wiggle into the system and manipulate it to get us to something that is fundamentally out of step with our entire constitutional order. I think, and one of the really, at a certain level, kind of amazing thing about the census is that it reflects a basic bargain and understanding at the core of our constitutional order, which is that everyone counts. We have a concept of political representation and a concept of political power that's supposed to be broader than just one subset of individuals. It's broader than voters. It includes everyone in the country. When you're able to stand up and be counted, you have an opportunity in a really meaningful way to make the government more like the way it should be, make it more responsive to your needs, make the people who hold political power more representative of your communities. But we seem every decade to have another set of runs at changing that basic constitutional understanding that people have fought very hard both to establish and maintain. And I think that if we could all get on the same page about this just very basic concept that is spelled out very clearly, everyone counts, we could focus on doing the things that we need to do to actually make sure everyone counts instead of trying to save the census from its worst case scenarios.
All right, well, that about does it for time. Our thanks again to Janae Nelson, Adriel Cepeda-Darrieux, and Tom Wolf. We wish you great success in your fight to get an accurate 2020 census. We're also grateful for the partnership with the Brooklyn Historical Society, the NYU Brademas Center, and the Brennan Center for Justice for collaborating on this program. I'm Osita Wanevu. Be on the lookout for an email from me with some interesting resources, including how to complete your census form online at my2020census.gov. It's the quick and a most efficient way to get the census done, despite all the challenges of the virus. And be sure to tell everyone you know to get counted in 2020. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.